At precisely 4:23 in the morning on March 17, 1944, two German military trains met on a fog-shrouded curve outside Epernay in occupied France. One carried a full complement of Tiger tanks destined for the Eastern Front. The other hauled ammunition, enough high explosives to supply an entire division for a month. The collision occurred at combined speeds exceeding 120 kilometers per hour. The explosion registered on seismographs as far as Reims. The lead locomotives crumpled into each other with such force that steel plating peeled back like paper. Fuel tanks ruptured, and within seconds, fire engulfed 30 rail cars. The ammunition detonated in waves, small arms first, then artillery shells, finally the heavy ordnance that sent debris raining down across the surrounding vineyards. When German rescue teams arrived at dawn, they found a quarter-kilometer of obliterated railway and the charred remains of what had been a Panzer Division's entire fuel and ammunition reserve. The German High Command launched an immediate investigation. How could two trains on the same track, both operating under strict schedule protocols, arrive at the exact same location at the exact same moment? The engineers had departed on time. The dispatchers had verified clearances. The signal systems showed no malfunction. Every station clock along both routes confirmed the schedules. The answer, when it finally emerged, would be far more subtle and far more devastating than sabotaged whales or planted explosives. A single elderly man, armed with nothing more than watchmaker's tools and a lifetime of expertise, had turned the Reich's obsession with punctuality into a weapon. France in 1944 was a nation in its 5th year of occupation. The railway system, once the engineering pride of the Republic, now served as the circulatory system of the Nazi war machine. Trains moved Wehrmacht divisions toward the crumbling Eastern Front, carried looted art and machinery back to Germany, and transported the captured and condemned to fates they rarely survived. Every junction, every switching yard, every signal tower operated under German control with mechanical precision. Curfews were absolute. Acts of sabotage were met with mass reprisals. The French people endured in silence, watching their infrastructure weaponized against the world. But in workshops and back rooms, in quiet acts of defiance that left no manifestos or heroic declarations, another France persisted. A France that understood resistance could take forms the occupiers never anticipated. In the town of Châlons-en-Champagne, 40 kilometers south of Reims, there lived a man who had devoted his entire adult life to the mastery of a single craft. Vale Voisin was 72 years old, and for 47 of those years he had been the master clockmaker responsible for maintaining the station timepieces. His workshop, a cramped room on the station's 3rd floor, was a sanctuary of gears and escapements and pendulum weights. Vale could diagnose a mechanical problem by sound alone. The whisper of a worn gear tooth, the hesitation in a pendulum swing. His hands, gnarled now with arthritis, had built and maintained the master clock system that governed every schedule, every departure, every arrival in a critical junction of France's rail network. The German railway officers who now controlled the station had no idea that their entire operation's temporal coordination depended on one elderly French craftsman who climbed ladders with a worn leather tool case and spoke only when spoken to. They saw him as they saw the furniture, a fixture so permanent as to be invisible. An old man who wound clocks and oiled mechanisms and posed no threat to anyone. Weil lived in a small apartment above a pharmacy that had long since run out of medicine. His wife had died before the war, and he had raised his daughter alone, teaching her the same precision and patience that clockmaking required. She had grown into a woman of quiet strength, married a teacher, given him a grandson. Then, in 1943, the Gestapo had come. Her daughter had been part of a resistance network passing information to Allied intelligence. They executed her in the courtyard of the local prison. Her husband and young son were deported east to camps whose names Weil heard whispered but never confirmed. The loss had not broken him. It had refined him, like heat refines metal, burning away everything except the essential core. Weil continued his work, maintaining the clocks with the same meticulous care he always had. To the Germans, he seemed defeated, compliant, a harmless old man waiting quietly for death. They failed to understand that patience, when combined with expertise and grief transformed into resolve, could become the most dangerous weapon of all. Weil had been studying the railway schedules with an intensity that belied his age. He knew which trains carried troops and which carried supplies. He understood the critical routes that fed the German war effort and the junction points where scheduling precision became life or death.
And he had realized something that no German logistics officer had considered. The entire system's coordination depended on synchronized time. Every station clock, every dispatcher's timepiece, every conductor's watch, all calibrated to match, all trusted implicitly. If the clocks lied, the system would believe the lie. The idea had come to him during a routine inspection of the main clock tower, standing before the master mechanism that he himself had installed decades ago. He understood, with the clarity that comes only from a lifetime of intimate knowledge, that he alone possessed the ability to manipulate time itself across the entire network. Not dramatically, not in ways that would raise immediate alarm, but gradually, methodically, with the precision of someone who had spent 50 years measuring microseconds. He could make 8 minutes disappear here, add 6 minutes there, create temporal discrepancies so subtle that each change would seem like ordinary mechanical drift, but which would compound across the network into catastrophic scheduling failures. Weil Voisin had built his reputation on keeping perfect time. Now he would destroy the enemy by making time lie.
Weil Voisin's workshop occupied a cramped room on the third floor of the Chalon-et-Champagne railway station, accessible only by a narrow iron staircase that German officers never bothered to climb. The space smelled of machine oil and old wood, its walls lined with shells holding spare escapements, coiled mainsprings, and glass jars of screws sorted by size with obsessive precision. A workbench sat beneath the room's single window, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. Here, surrounded by the mechanisms that had defined his adult life, Weil had become what every occupied nation produces in wartime, a person so thoroughly part of the infrastructure that he ceased to exist as an individual in the occupier's consciousness. He had maintained the station's timepieces since 1897, when he was 25, and the Third Republic still believed in progress and permanence. The master clock in the main tower was his creation, built to specifications he had drafted himself, a weight-driven mechanism with a mercury-compensated pendulum that kept accuracy within 2 seconds per week. Every subordinate clock in the station, every platform timepiece, every dispatcher's wall clock received its coordination from that central heartbeat. Weil knew each mechanism intimately, could identify which clock had stopped by the quality of silence it left behind. The German Railway Administration, the Deutsche Reichsbahn Französische, arrived in June 2040 with ledgers and schedules and an unwavering faith in mechanical order. They interviewed Vale once, confirmed his technical competence, and promptly forgot he existed. To Hauptmann Steiner, the logistics officer who now occupied the station master's former office, Vale was simply the old man who appeared every Tuesday and Friday to wind the clocks. Steiner would pass him in corridors without acknowledgement, discussing troop movements and supply schedules as though Vale were deaf or simple or both. This invisibility had not come easily. He had learned to make himself small, to move through the station with the unobtrusive efficiency of a janitor. He kept his eyes down, his responses monosyllabic. When German soldiers filled the platforms waiting for trains that would carry them east toward battles they might not survive, Vale walked among them adjusting platform clocks, and they saw only an elderly craftsman performing maintenance too mundane to warrant attention. But Vale heard everything. He heard Steiner complain about scheduling delays that cost the Wehrmacht precious hours. He heard SS officers discuss the coordination required to move entire divisions across France's rail network. He learned which trains carried munitions, which carried troops, which routes fed the Atlantic wall defenses, and which supplied the collapsing Eastern Front. The Germans spoke freely around him because servants and tradesmen, in their minds, lacked the capacity to understand strategic importance. They had made a profound miscalculation. Vale understood logistics with the mind of an engineer who had spent 50 years ensuring the trains arrived when passengers expected them. He understood the fragility of complex systems, how a single point of failure could cascade into comprehensive collapse. And now, standing in his workshop each evening as occupation stretched into its 5th year, Vale understood that the weapon he needed had been in his hands all along, the ability to make time itself unreliable, and the access to do so without anyone suspecting that the humble keeper of clocks had become an agent of calculated chaos. They came for his daughter on a Tuesday night in October 1943. Vale heard the vehicles first, the distinctive sound of German trucks stopping outside the apartment building where Marie lived with her husband and son. He was in his own flat above the pharmacy, reading by candlelight to preserve the last of his lamp oil when the shouting started. By the time he reached the street, the Gestapo had already brought them out. Marie walked between 2 officers with her head raised, refusing the indignity of being dragged. Her husband, Paul, a secondary school mathematics teacher, carried their 12-year-old son, trying to shield the boy's face from what was happening. Vale tried to reach them. A German soldier, barely 20 years old, pushed him back with the butt of a rifle, not brutally, but with the casual indifference of someone moving furniture. Marie saw him in that moment. She did not cry or call out. She simply looked at him with an expression that he would carry for the rest of his life. Not fear, but an urgent, silent communication that seemed to say everything she had never found time to tell him about courage and choice and the impossibility of remaining neutral when the world demands you choose sides. The Gestapo files, which would be discovered after liberation, recorded the charges with bureaucratic precision. Marie Dubois had been passing railway schedules and German troop movement information to a resistance network connected to British intelligence. Her husband was arrested as an accomplice. Their 12-year-old son was deported as policy. The Reich did not leave potential revenge behind. The reports noted that information had been gathered through casual observation at railway stations, which meant Marie had been watching the trains her father maintained, counting boxcars and noting unit insignia and departure times, then finding ways to transmit what she learned to people who could use it. Vale taught her to observe carefully, to see patterns, to understand how systems worked. He had raised her to believe that precision and accuracy were moral virtues. She had learned those lessons and applied them to resistance. Marie was executed 3 weeks later in the courtyard of the Chalon prison. Paul and their son were sent east on a transport marked for Buchenwald. Vale learned these facts in fragments, through whispered conversations and official notifications that arrived with Germanic thoroughness. The Reich documented everything, even its atrocities. For weeks afterwards, Vail continued his work, maintaining the clocks with mechanical efficiency, while something fundamental shifted inside him. He had spent 50 years believing that his craft was neutral, that keeping accurate time served whoever needed punctuality. He had told himself that a clockmaker bore no responsibility for how his precision was used, just as a maker of knives could not be blamed for murder. But Marie's arrest had destroyed that comfortable lie. The trains that departed on schedule carried people to their deaths. The coordination he maintained enabled the machinery of occupation and genocide. There was no neutrality in precision when that precision served evil. Every clock he wound, every mechanism he repaired, made him complicit in a system that had taken his daughter's life and stolen his grandson's future. The only question remaining was whether he would continue to serve that system or whether he would use his gift to tear it apart from within.
The system Vail had built over 47 years was a masterpiece of coordinated timekeeping, though he had never considered it in terms of vulnerability until grief sharpened his perception. The master clock in the station's tower controlled 17 subsidiary mechanisms throughout the building and railway complex through a combination of mechanical impulses and electrical signals. Every hour, the master clock sent a corrective pulse, a brief electromagnetic signal that synchronized every connected timepiece to within half a second of absolute accuracy. Vail designed the system himself in 1912, when electricity was still novel enough to inspire faith in technological progress. The master clock's pendulum, compensated for temperature variations by a mercury reservoir, maintained astronomical accuracy. From this central authority, copper wires ran through conduits in the station's walls to platform clocks, dispatchers' offices, the signal tower, the freight coordination room, and the station master's suite that Hauptmann Steiner now occupied. Each subsidiary clock contained an electromagnetic solenoid that received the hourly correction signal, advancing or retarding its mechanism to match the master's proclamation of correct time. The Deutsche Reichsbahn had inherited this system without understanding its architecture. To German logistics officers, the clocks simply worked, displaying synchronized time with the reliability they demanded. They never questioned the mechanisms behind that reliability, never considered that the entire network's temporal coordination depended on impulses originating from a single master clock controlled by one elderly French craftsman. Vail spent 3 weeks mapping the system's vulnerabilities with the methodical care of someone planning a cathedral's construction. He spread stolen railway schedules across his workbench, cross-referencing departure times with the network of stations between Chalon and Paris, between Chalon and the German border, between Chalon and the Channel ports. Each station maintained its own clock system, most of them mechanical rather than electrical, requiring manual winding and adjustment. Vail knew the clockmakers at 7 of these stations personally, men like himself who had maintained railway time for decades. The revelation came to him one evening while examining the Deutsche Reichsbahn's coordination protocols.
German efficiency demanded that trains depart and arrive according to published schedules synchronized across the entire occupied network. Dispatchers relied on their station clocks to authorize departures. Engineers trusted their conductors' watches calibrated against platform timepieces. Signal operators granted clearances based on scheduled timings displayed on their office clocks. The entire system operated on faith that time, as displayed by official railway mechanisms, represented objective truth. But time, Vail understood, was not objective. It was a human construct maintained by mechanical devices that required constant correction and adjustment. The master clock in his tower did not measure some cosmic truth. It simply ticked at a rate that humans had agreed to call accurate. And if that rate changed, if the master clock began to drift in ways too subtle for casual observation, but significant enough to compound across the network, then every subordinate mechanism would faithfully reproduce the lie. Dispatchers would authorize trains based on false schedules. Engineers would depart at incorrect times while believing themselves punctual. The entire architecture of coordination would collapse, not through obvious sabotage, but through the gradual erosion of the one thing the system could not function without: synchronized time that told the truth. The moment that transformed theory into action occurred in a December morning in 1943 in the dispatcher's office where Vail had come to adjust the wall-mounted regulator clock. Hauptmann Wolf, a railway logistics officer recently transferred from the Eastern Front, stood at the scheduling board with two subordinates discussing the coordination of an ammunition convoy destined for the Atlantic Wall fortifications. Vail worked quietly at his ladder, his hands moving through the familiar motions of opening the clock's glass face and checking the escapement mechanism, while Wolf's voice carried across the room with the confidence of someone who believed servants were functionally deaf. "The entire shipment must reach Calais by Thursday morning," Wolf said, tracing a route on the wall map with his finger. 23 railcars of artillery shells and anti-tank munitions. The schedule allows no flexibility. The unloading crews are coordinated with tide schedules for the coastal battery installations. If the train arrives even 2 hours late, we lose an entire day's worth of fortification work. One of the subordinates raised a concern about potential delays at the Reims junction, where heavy troop movements often created bottlenecks. Wolf dismissed this with the certainty that had made the Reich's logistics function with industrial efficiency. The system accounts for such variables. Every station operates on synchronized time. Every dispatcher follows the published schedule. As long as the clocks are accurate and the schedules are followed, the trains move like clockwork. The phrase struck Vail with the force of revelation. Like clockwork, the German officer had just articulated the entire system's foundational assumption and its critical vulnerability in a single casual metaphor. The Reich's logistics machine functioned because it trusted mechanical precision absolutely. Trains departed when clocks indicated the scheduled time. Dispatchers granted clearances based on temporal calculations. Signal operators coordinated track usage through synchronized timing protocols. Remove that trust, introduce uncertainty into the temporal foundation, and the entire architecture of coordination would begin to fracture, not through obvious sabotage, but through the gradual erosion of the one thing the system could not function without: synchronized time that told the truth. Vail finished his adjustment and descended the ladder, his presence so unremarkable that Wolf continued his briefing without pause. But as Vail walked back to his workshop, his mind was racing through calculations. The ammunition convoy Wolf described would pass through at least 4 major stations before reaching Calais. Each station's clocks governed local scheduling decisions. If those clocks disagreed about the current time by even a few minutes, if the Reims dispatcher believed it was 14:05 while the Chalons clock showed 13:58, then authorization protocols would begin to misalign. A train cleared to depart at 1400 from one station might arrive at a junction where another train, also operating on its correct schedule, occupied the same track segment. The mathematics of catastrophe became suddenly beautifully clear. Vail did not need to derail trains or damage tracks or plant explosives. He simply needed to make the clocks lie in carefully calculated ways, creating temporal discrepancies that would compound across the network until the system's faith in synchronized time became its mechanism of self-destruction. The ammunition convoy Wolfe described with such confidence would become his first test, not of sabotage, but of temporal manipulation so precise that the Germans would never suspect human agency behind the chaos. They would blame mechanical failure, operator error, the inevitable friction of complex systems operating under wartime stress. They would never imagine that an elderly clockmaker had weaponized the very punctuality they trusted absolutely.
Weil began his work in the first week of January 1944, moving through the station's clock network with the patient deliberation of someone planting a garden that would bloom months later. The master clock in the tower remained untouched. It was inspected too frequently, its accuracy verified against radio time signals from Paris. Instead, Weil focused on the subsidiary mechanisms, the platform clocks and office regulators that received synchronization pulses, but which German personnel rarely examined with technical scrutiny. His first adjustment was to the westbound platform clock, made during his regular Tuesday maintenance visit. He opened the mechanism's rear access panel and located the rating nut, a small threaded component that controlled the effective length of the pendulum and thus its rate of oscillation. By turning this nut a quarter rotation counterclockwise, he lengthened the pendulum by less than a millimeter. The change was invisible to casual observation, but it would cause the clock to lose approximately 8 seconds per day. Over 6 weeks, this would accumulate to nearly 6 minutes of error. The dispatcher's office clock received the opposite treatment 2 days later. Weil shortened its pendulum fractionally, causing it to gain 4 seconds daily. In isolation, either adjustment would be attributed to normal mechanical drift. Clocks required periodic regulation, and small timing errors were expected in any complex system. But Weil was not working in isolation. He was composing a symphony of temporal discord, each instrument slightly out of tune in ways that would harmonize into deliberate chaos. Over the following weeks, Weil adjusted 7 more clocks across the Chalon station and 2 at the Reims Junction during a scheduled inspection trip. He worked with the careful precision of a surgeon, making changes so subtle that daily verification against the master clock showed nothing alarming. A minute here, 90 seconds there. Errors small enough to be noted in maintenance logs as routine calibration issues, but significant enough to corrupt the temporal coordination the Deutsche Reichsbahn depended upon. The art lay in calculating convergence. He needed the accumulated errors to align at a specific moment when multiple trains would be operating in proximity. He studied the published schedules with obsessive attention, noting that on March 17th, 2 supply convoys were scheduled through the Epernay Junction, one from Chalon carrying fuel and ammunition, the other from Reims transporting armored vehicles. Both trains would depart their respective stations at times governed by clocks Weil had manipulated. Both trains would travel routes where signal coordination depended on synchronized timing assumptions. If the Chalon's dispatcher's clock showed 04:15 when the actual time was 04:09, the ammunition train would depart 6 minutes earlier than its official schedule indicated. If the Reims clock ran 4 minutes fast, the armor convoy would leave believing itself punctual while actually departing ahead of its designated slot. Both trains, operating on schedules their crews believed correct, would converge on the same section of track at Epernay, a curved approach with limited visibility where the slower armor train would still be occupying the line when the faster ammunition convoy arrived at full speed. Weil made his final adjustments in early March, then resumed normal maintenance routines.
The clocks ticked towards catastrophe with the same mechanical indifference they had always shown, measuring out seconds that would compound into minutes that would translate into collision and fire. He had transformed time itself into a weapon, and now he could only wait for the mathematics of his sabotage to become fire. The first sign of danger came in the form of attention, the one thing Weil had spent years avoiding. Sergeant Emil Richter had arrived at the Chalon station in late February as part of a Wehrmacht security detail assigned to protect critical railway infrastructure from resistance sabotage. Unlike the logistics officers who passed through daily, Richter possessed the observational instincts of someone trained to notice patterns and deviations. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the weathered face of a soldier who had seen combat and survived through vigilance rather than luck. Richter began appearing in places where Weil worked, not obviously following, not conducting formal surveillance, but present. Standing on platforms when Weil adjusted the station clocks, lingering in corridors when Weil carried his tool case to the dispatcher's office, watching from the station entrance when Weil arrived for his Tuesday and Friday visits. The sergeant asked no questions initially, simply observed with the patient attention of someone assembling a puzzle without yet understanding what picture the pieces would form. Weil felt the scrutiny like pressure against his chest, but he maintained his routine with inflexible consistency. He arrived at precisely the same time each visit, carried the same worn leather case, performed his work with the same methodical efficiency he had demonstrated for 47 years. To alter his pattern now would confirm whatever suspicions were forming in Richter's mind. The only defense against observation was to be exactly what he appeared to be, an elderly craftsman performing unremarkable maintenance on mechanical devices that required regular attention. But Richter was not satisfied with surface consistency. 3 weeks before the scheduled collision, he approached Weil in the clock tower when Weil was winding the master mechanism. The sergeant's German was careful and correct, his tone professionally neutral. "You come here often, twice a week for many years, I am told." Weil replied in the same measured tone, his French-accented German deliberately unpracticed. "The clocks require regular maintenance, Sergeant. Mechanical devices do not maintain themselves." "You come early. Sometimes you stay late." Richter was not quite asking a question, merely stating observations and waiting for Weil to fill the silence with explanation. "The work requires time. I am old, and my hands are not as quick as they once were." Weil continued winding the master clock's weight mechanism, his movements betraying no anxiety, despite the rapid acceleration of his pulse. Richter walked slowly around the tower room, examining the subsidiary clock mechanisms mounted on the walls, the copper wires running through conduits, the maintenance logs Weil kept in meticulous longhand. There have been scheduling problems, small delays, missed connections. Hauptmann Wolf believes the system is under stress from increased traffic, but you would know if the clocks were failing, would you not? The question hung in the air like smoke. Weil understood he was being tested, that his response would either satisfy or sharpen Richter's suspicions. He set down his winding key and turned to face the sergeant directly, meeting his gaze with the exhausted dignity of an old man who had endured 5 years of occupation. "The clocks function as they always have, Sergeant. I adjust them when they drift, which is normal. If there are scheduling problems, perhaps it is because war creates chaos that even German precision cannot entirely eliminate." It was a dangerous reply, carrying the faintest edge of something that might be interpreted as disrespect. But Richter seemed to accept it as the weary honesty of someone too old to maintain elaborate deceptions. The sergeant nodded once and left the tower without further questions. Yet Weil knew the scrutiny would continue. Richter was not convinced, merely waiting for evidence to confirm or dismiss his instincts. And that meant Weil would need to work under observation, maintaining his sabotage while appearing to do nothing more suspicious than the work he had performed for nearly half a century.
On March 15th, 2 days before the scheduled collision, Weil climbed the tower stairs for what he knew would be his final modification. The westbound platform clock required one last adjustment, a subtle recalibration that would ensure the ammunition train's dispatcher would authorize departure at precisely the wrong moment. Weil's hands shook as he opened his tool case, though whether from arthritis or anxiety he could no longer distinguish. He had just removed the clock's rear access panel when he heard boots on the iron stairs. Richter emerged into the tower room, his presence filling the cramped space with unspoken accusation. The sergeant said nothing initially, simply positioned himself where he could observe Weil's hands and the exposed clock mechanisms simultaneously. Weil forced himself to continue working with deliberate slowness, removing the pendulum assembly to access the rating mechanism beneath. His mind raced through calculations. The adjustment he needed to make required turning the rating nut 3 complete rotations, a change significant enough that Richter might recognize it as excessive for routine maintenance. But stopping now, abandoning the work, would appear suspicious itself. "You work on this clock frequently," Richter observed, his tone carrying the accumulated observations. "Your maintenance logs show 4 adjustments in the past 6 weeks. That seems excessive for a mechanism that should remain stable once properly calibrated." Weil kept his eyes on the exposed gears, his arthritic fingers working to loosen the rating nut, while his voice maintained the patient tone of someone explaining technical matters to a layperson. "The platform clocks are exposed to temperature variations, Sergeant. When trains arrive, steam from the locomotives creates thermal expansion. The metal components expand and contract, affecting the pendulum's effective length. I compensate for these variations to maintain accuracy." It was technically true, though the adjustments he had been making far exceeded what temperature compensation required. Richter moved closer, watching Weil's hands with focused attention. "And this adjustment you are making now, how much correction does temperature require?" The rating nut came free in Weil's fingers. 3 full rotations would add the final minutes of error needed for convergence, but Richter was watching, and such a dramatic change would be impossible to justify. Weil's hands trembled as he confronted the impossible choice: complete his mission and confirm Richter's suspicions, or preserve his cover and allow the trains to pass safely on their scheduled routes. Then inspiration arrived with the clarity of desperation. Weil deliberately fumbled the rating nut, his arthritic fingers appearing to lose grip on the small component. It fell, rolling across the tower floor towards the access door. Richter reflexively moved to retrieve it, turning away for the 3 seconds Weil needed. His hands moved with speed that betrayed their supposed infirmity, turning the adjustment screw 3 complete rotations, then repositioning the pendulum assembly. By the time Richter returned with the nut, Weil had his hand extended to receive it, his expression showing nothing but an old man's embarrassed frustration at his own clumsiness. "Thank you, Sergeant. My hands fail me more each year." He installed the nut with exaggerated care, tightened the assembly, and closed the access panel. The clock resumed its ticking, now running with the carefully calculated error that would compound over the next 48 hours into the temporal discrepancy needed for catastrophe. Richter remained in the tower while Weil packed his tools, the sergeant's suspicion palpable but unproven. As Weil descended the iron stairs, his legs weak with relief and horror, he understood that he had just committed to mass death through a moment of deception so precise that it had required 5 decades of expertise to execute. The clocks would now lie with perfect mechanical consistency, and in 2 days, mathematics would become fire,
and precision would become weapon, and an old man's grief would be transformed into burning steel and the screams of men who trusted that their watches told them truth. Vale did not sleep on the night of March 16th. He sat in his workshop, surrounded by the quiet ticking of timepieces awaiting repair, and calculated trajectories with the obsessive precision of someone who needed to know exactly what his mathematics would produce. The ammunition train would depart Chalons at 3:47, according to the station's manipulated clock, though actual time was 3:41. The armor convoy would leave Rams at 3:52 by its clock's reckoning, actually 3:56. Both trains would converge on the curved approach outside Epernay, where limited sightlines and the momentum of fully loaded rail cars would make collision inevitable once the engineers realized their error. Vale left his apartment before dawn, taking the road that led to the hills overlooking the Epernay junction. The morning fog clung to the vineyards with the density that March mornings produced in the Champagne region, reducing visibility to ghostly shapes and muffled sounds. Vale found a position on a low ridge, perhaps a kilometer from the tracks, close enough to observe, but distant enough to remain unnoticed. He checked his pocket watch, a chronometer he had built himself, calibrated against astronomical observations, the only timepiece he still trusted to tell truth. 4:18. The ammunition train appeared first, emerging from the fog like a mechanical apparition, its locomotive pulling 30 rail cars loaded with shells and explosives that would never reach their intended batteries. Vale could hear the rhythm of its passage, the particular cadence of a fully loaded freight train moving at operational speed. The engineer would be checking his watch, confirming his schedule, believing himself precisely on time because every clock he trusted told him so. Then, from the opposite direction, the second locomotive's whistle cut through the fog. The armor convoy, also punctual according to its dispatcher's clock, also occupying track it had every authorization to use. Vale saw the moment of recognition, both engineers applying brakes simultaneously, the squeal of steel on steel as friction fought momentum and lost. The trains were too close, moving too fast, carrying too much mass for physics to offer mercy. The collision occurred at 4:23, exactly as Vale's calculations predicted. The sound reached him as a prolonged crash of metal tearing and compressing, followed by the deeper concussion of exploding ammunition. Fire bloomed in the fog, backlighting the wreckage with orange light that turned the morning into something hellish and biblical. Secondary explosions followed as artillery cells cooked off in sequence, each detonation adding debris to the chaos. Vale stood on the hillside and watched his precision made manifest. He had done this. His calculations, his adjustments, his 5 decades of expertise, all transformed into fire and destruction. The professional part of his mind registered the success with grim satisfaction. He had proven that complex systems could be destroyed not through crude force, but through the subtle corruption of the assumptions they depended upon. The Reich's logistics machine had trusted its clocks, and that trust became its vulnerability.
But beneath the satisfaction lay something darker and more permanent. Vale thought of Marie, of her quiet courage in that final moment before the Gestapo took her. She had resisted, knowing the cost, accepting that her actions might save lives elsewhere, but would certainly end her own. He had honored her memory by becoming what she had been, someone willing to act against evil, regardless of personal consequence. Yet watching the fires burn through the thinning fog, hearing the distant shouts of rescue teams and the continuing explosions of munitions, Vale understood that righteous resistance still carried the weight of the dead. Those were men burning in the wreckage, soldiers perhaps, but also sons and brothers and humans who trusted their watches to tell them truth. His daughter had gathered information. He had manufactured death. Both had served the same cause, but the moral mathematics felt different when measured in burning flesh rather than intercepted schedules.
Liberation came to Châlons-en-Champagne in August 1944, brought by American forces who arrived with jeeps and confidence and chewing gum for children who had forgotten what candy tasted like. The German officers evacuated in disciplined retreat, taking their files and schedules but leaving behind the infrastructure they had controlled. Weil watched them go from his workshop window, feeling neither triumph nor relief, only the exhausted recognition that one chapter had ended while the consequences of his actions would extend indefinitely into whatever peace followed. The collision at Épernay had been attributed to mechanical failure and the chaos of wartime railway operations. German investigators had examined the clocks, found them within acceptable tolerances by the time inspections occurred, and concluded that dispatcher error or signal malfunction had caused the tragedy. Richter had questioned Weil twice more, his suspicions unresolved but unprovable. The sergeant had been transferred east in April and likely died in the final desperate months of the Reich's collapse. Weil never learned whether Richter had taken his suspicions with him to the grave, or whether some record existed, filed away in archives that would remain classified for decades. In September, Weil received a letter from the Red Cross. His grandson had survived Buchenwald and was convalescing in an American military hospital in Belgium. Paul, his son-in-law, had died of typhus 2 weeks before liberation. The news arrived as a mixed blessing that Weil had learned to expect from a war that dealt only in partial victories and compromised survivals. He traveled to Belgium and found his grandson, 14 years old now, thin in ways that spoke of prolonged starvation, with eyes that had seen things no child should witness. They did not speak much during that first reunion. Weil held the boy and felt the fragility of bones that had been systematically starved, and understood that his sabotage had not prevented this suffering, had perhaps contributed to extending a war that inflicted such horrors on millions. The moral calculus of resistance offered no clean equations, no way to balance the deaths he had caused against the deaths he might have prevented by disrupting German supply lines. Mathematics could predict collision, but could not measure whether the fire he had created justified itself. Weil returned to Châlons-en-Champagne and resumed his work maintaining the railway clocks. The French authorities, recognizing his decades of service, kept him employed despite his age. He wound mechanisms and adjusted pendulums with the same precision he had always practiced. But now every clock face seemed to reflect the morning at Épernay, the mathematics of disruption made manifest in burning steel. His grandson came to live with him in 1945 after the hospitals released him and the humanitarian organizations exhausted their resources. The boy rarely spoke about the camps, and Weil never told him about the collision. Some burdens could not be shared, some truths served no purpose except to multiply grief. They existed together in the apartment above the pharmacy, two survivors of different atrocities, learning to navigate a peace that felt less like victory than exhausted cessation. Weil continued working until 1952, when arthritis finally made the tower stairs impossible to climb. He trained his replacement, a young man who had served in the resistance and who listened with respectful attention as Weil explained the principles of synchronized timekeeping. On his final day, Weil stood in the tower room and placed his hand on the master clock he had built 60 decades earlier, feeling its steady tick against his palm. The mechanism knew nothing of the purposes it had served, the lives coordinated and the deaths enabled by its perfect rhythm. He died in 1954, attended by his grandson, who had become a mathematics teacher, perhaps seeking in equations the order that history had denied him. Vail's obituary in the local newspaper noted his 55 years of service to the railway, his technical expertise, and his survival of the occupation. It made no mention of resistance activities, for his sabotage left no evidence except the memory he carried, the knowledge that precision could be weaponized, that expertise could serve destruction, and that a life spent measuring seconds could be justified only by accepting that some forms of accuracy required deliberate deception, and that the burden of such choices must be carried in silence until death offers the only release from perfect, terrible accountability.
The story is inspired by documented acts of railway sabotage in occupied France, though Vail Voisin is a fictional character representing the courage of elderly resistors whose contributions are often overlooked in wartime narratives. The French railway workers' resistance, including both violent sabotage and subtle disruption of German logistics, significantly impacted the occupying forces' ability to move troops and supplies. Technical details about railway clock synchronization systems and the vulnerability of precision-dependent logistics are drawn from historical railway engineering documentation and accounts of SNCF, French National Railway, operations during World War II. Many elderly French citizens participated in resistance activities, using their perceived harmlessness and established positions to gather intelligence and commit sabotage. While this specific narrative is fictionalized, it honors the memory of those who understood that resistance takes many forms and belongs to all generations willing to risk everything for freedom.